Exodus 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt, and I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians.
Words that you don't understand. I know verse 16, that's the word trough, right? Trough. T-R-O-U-G-H.
Which passage?
Yeah, trough first. Trough. 16, verse 16, trough. What's a trough? T-R-O-U-G-H.
That's a container.
It is container
For drinking water?
Yes. A trough is a container for drinking water, and in this case, for the sheep, for the animals. Yeah. So, because the 7 daughters of Midian, or of Ruel, they are shepherdesses. They were looking after sheep. So they came with the sheep and they drink from the trough. Okay? So we human beings drink from cups, but animals, they go down and they drink from the trough. Okay, and papyrus basket, Matthew is saying the papyrus basket is in verse 3. What's a papyrus basket? It's a kind of plant. It's a fiber. The papyrus is a plant that grows by the river banks in Egypt. Lots and lots of it. It grows by the river banks. It's like grass. Okay, you think of grass blades, very tall and very high up. And papyrus, from the word papyrus comes another word in the English language, paper. Because the ancient Egyptians used the fiber of the plant, the leaf, the papyrus leaf, they dry it in the sun and they spread it up and then they glue it all together layer by layer and they use it as paper for writing. So some of you say, oh, but the Chinese invented paper. Oh yeah, yes, the Chinese did. Rice paper. Okay, this is papyrus paper. It's a different material and it is also used for writing. But in terms of time chronology, invention of the Chinese paper is first. Yeah. Chinese paper is earlier than the Egyptian paper. Okay, but the name comes from the Egyptian papyrus plant. Okay, so these are little bits of color here and there that tell us this book was written by somebody who lived in Egypt, not somebody who is imagining, imaginative fiction. I live in Israel and I have no idea, I've never been to Israel and I write this story. And people do that. Let me give you a very modern example. There is a song I used to like very much, and it's called, the title of the song is On a Little Street in Singapore. On a little street in Singapore. It's a jazz song, yeah? And it's cool, it's a jazz.
You never been there?
He's never been to Singapore. The guy who wrote this song wrote it in, I think, the 1930s, 1940s. Never been to Singapore. Yeah. He just needed the song, and the song to have three, so Singapore.
Yeah.
And it rhymes with the next word, So you think, okay, what word do I use? Oh, Singapore. So, and you read through the whole song, all the description of this street that he saw, he cannot recognize the street. It's never recognized in Singapore at all, right? So yes, sometimes when you read a story or a song and they talk about a place, they obviously have never been there because the description is all wrong. But when you read the book of Exodus, so many details. I'll give you some last week and this week and later on. There's so many details that speak of a knowledge of Egyptian and Egyptian culture. Okay, the city of Ramesses, earlier on, the first chapter we're talking about, the Hebrew slaves were made to build the city of Pithom and Ramesses. They are actual cities that do exist in Egypt. And imagine these are people, if you think of the Hebrew writer of this book, and if you think he never been to Egypt, he only lived in Israel. Remember in those days they didn't have travel like we have today. To travel from Egypt, from Israel to Egypt would have taken months and months, and most people won't bother. Not like today, you just take 1 hour flight and you're in someplace else. Right? Today, we still haven't gone into the meat of it, because today we're just going to talk about the birth of Moses, the man that God was using to deliver Israel from slavery. For those of you who attended Pastor Bunyan's sessions on the life of Jesus, last two Saturdays, you have heard him say that when Jesus came, the gospel writers, the four of them, were very, very consciously using the Exodus theme, the motif, the theme, right? The motif of the Exodus, which is there is a deliverer. The deliverer will deliver you through water. You will exit sin. You will exit your sin and enter heaven, the promised land. So the theme of Exodus, that's the reason why we need to read Exodus. We cannot reject the Old Testament. A lot of people say, I don't want to read the Old Testament. It's very hard to understand. It's too boring. It is very very difficult to read, all these all the names I cannot pronounce. And then they reject it, and I tell them, you are rejecting 3/4 of the Bible.
Yeah.
How can you be a Christian if you reject 3/4? I mean, you just graduated, right? And the professor gives you a textbook. He says, sorry, I read only the last 10 pages. You will fail, right? You will not graduate. So, but why do a lot of Christians do that? Okay, so I want you to be not scared. Yeah, go with me through the book of Exodus. There are many things that will worry you, it's hard to understand and so on, but we must try to understand. Now, one of the things that you realize is, well, the writer of Exodus, the writers of the Bible, they fast forward when they need to. 40 chapters of Exodus, I told you last week, covers 430 years of history. 430 years. But the first chapter covers 300 plus years. Okay, let's do the math. Okay, 430 is the answer. First chapter, 300 something, we'll work it out. Second chapter, let me tell you the second chapter. The chapter we have read today.
Sorry, first chapter.
Not yet, I haven't given the number yet.
What is 430? Total, right?
Total number of years. Okay,
Exodus.
in Exodus, up to chapter 40. Second chapter, you know how many years is covered in that second chapter? It's from the birth of Moses until Moses runs away to Midian and marries his wife Zipporah.
40 years.
40 years. 40 years. One chapter. 40 years. Fast forward. Very fast forward, yeah? And chapter 3, by the end of chapter 3, you would have covered how many more years? When Moses goes to Egypt, another 40. And then the rest of the chapters after chapter 4 onwards all the way to chapter 40. How many years?
40 years.
40?
Oh my God.
1 year.
So the first one is 300.
So this first one will be 300 and what?
My math is bad.
This is good in
3. 430.
49? That's very, very fast forward, yeah? You want to zoom 349 years. Why? Because the writer of the book of Exodus wants to focus. It's very important this 1 year. This 1 year, the Jews will learn a lot from God in this 1 year after they leave Egypt. And hopefully in the next 1 year, we will learn those things that they learned that one year long ago. Yeah. Okay, so I have mentioned the meaning of Moses, the name of Moses, and I mentioned that he spent 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in the desert, and he was 80 years old when he went back to the king, the Pharaoh. And we know that he died age 120. So his life was 40, 40, 40. 40 years, Prince of Egypt. 40 years, shepherd. 40 years, the leader. And that's why we were thinking that's more Numbers in Leviticus. Yeah. The rest of the 40 years leading the people of Israel into the promised land. For those of you who say, where's the proof? Okay, if you need it, Acts 7. Turn with me to Acts chapter 7. And Acts chapter 7 is a speech given by Stephen. Acts chapter 7, verse 17. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt greatly increased. Then another king who knew nothing about Joseph became ruler of Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so they would die. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, okay, so that's verse 23, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Man, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. And then verse 30, after 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. That's chapter 3. So Stephen has summarized chapter 1 and chapter 2, the story of Moses. So that's 40 plus 40, and Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 7 is the last book that Moses wrote, and it tells us the date that he died, and it would have been added on perhaps by Joshua. The last few sentences of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of Moses, and it tells us that Moses died at age 120. Okay, so that's the quick background of Moses and the 3 stages of his life. You will find that in Egypt, he was educated in the best university in the world at that time. Egypt was the only superpower, and the palace of Egypt would have been the best school. He would have learned what? History, geography, literature, leadership, math, yeah, everything. Everything that he needed to be the future leader of. And the laws, you would have been very familiar with the laws. So sometimes when non-believing scholars say, okay, the laws of Moses, they are not new. They sound like the laws of Hammurabi, they sound like the laws of the Babylonians and Sumerians and all that. It doesn't matter. He learned it in Egypt in a palace. Doesn't mean that God cannot say, some of those laws are good, some of those laws are bad. I want you to pick up those good laws and make them the laws of Israel. So doesn't mean that because that he was familiar with the laws of Sumeria and Babylon and all the other early stages that he copied it and it wasn't from God. But it can still be from God because God would have said, out of the wisdom you learn from Egypt, some are good, some are bad. Keep the good ones. Some non-believing scholars would say Moses couldn't have written the 5 books of Moses because he didn't know how to write. Well, he lived in Egypt, he was a prince of Egypt, he would have been educated, and writing was already invented by the time of the Egyptians. So it's not, again, right to say that Moses couldn't have written it because he didn't know how to write.
So that's not oral tradition. All the things Moses
It could have been oral tradition in the beginning, of course, but it can still be written down within the life of Moses, right? And the culture of Israel and the Palestinian cultures, they are oral cultures, and the fact that it's oral does not mean he couldn't have written it, but it can be a parallel situation where parts of it are written. For those who still haven't written it, they may memorize it and they pass it on orally. There isn't any record of people leaving Egypt in a large number like that and moving out to Israel. But there is a record round about the 13th century BC, before Christ, of an Egyptian pharaoh, Menapteh, who has a record of how he defeated the Hebrews in Palestine, which means by that time they were already in Israel, right? And there are records of a people called the Habiru, who were slaves in Egypt. So little traces there, here and there, tell us that there is absolutely every possibility that Egypt had these people, but they did not have a record because you do not keep a record of the
Or maybe
things,
we didn't know.
the things of your own shame. Yeah. Plus, of course, I mentioned in the last lecture, like two weeks ago, I think, on the historical background of Egypt, and there is one particular period around the 15th century before Christ, where there was a king who was actually kicked out of Egypt. He was a foreigner, just like I mentioned, like the Mongolians were chased out. So the people of Egypt chased out this king, and then they started having Hebrew slaves, which fits in very well with the possibility that the king that knew Joseph had been kicked out. He was a foreign king, and he was a Semitic king. He was a Semite. That means he was from the same area as Palestine. So he would have been very friendly with Joseph, possibly. And then they got kicked out. The kings got kicked out, and then the Egyptians took over. And during that period, there were cities built to defend themselves against the people from the north, east. So there are possibilities that the story is true, except that the record is so ancient that perhaps it's not perfect. Okay? Now there was this very enticing possibility. There was a king, Amenhotep, who died, and let me see. There was this king who actually, then the next king took over, and he had put on record the reason why he was king, and that was that he had been given a dream. So some scholars look at this as this king wasn't scheduled to be king, but he had to justify his kingship. So he says, I was given a dream that I will be king. And so they think that there's possibility that the earlier king died suddenly, and so they had to have another king. And this other king had to justify his position. So there are all these enticing possibilities. I'm not saying that they're absolutely proven, but there are enough details to tell us that yes, Egypt wouldn't have a record because they wouldn't keep a record of their own defeats. Kings keep a record of their victories, not their defeats.
Or maybe we didn't find out. Just like
Yes,
the
that
Dead
is
Sea
correct.
Scrolls.
Because it's buried so deep and we have not been able to find it yet. So nonetheless, as I said, as we look at the book of Exodus itself, there are enough evidences that the person who wrote this was Egyptian, or at least, well, it was Hebrew, but he knew enough of Egypt that it would have been sort of authentic. Now, I want to move on to this idea about names. Okay. Now, another problem, I want to spend some time on these so-called problems of the Old Testament and the book of Exodus. One other problem that is raised is, if you look at Exodus chapter 2 and the verse 18, you are told that Moses' potential father-in-law is a man called Ruel. Excuse me. And then you read chapter 3, verse 1. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Now it's the same person. Verse 16 says priest of Midian. So the same person is Ruel and Jethro. And if you go read further into the Old Testament, and you'll find other references to the father-in-law of Moses. And Judges actually refers to him as Hobab. Judges chapter 4 verse 11. And even Numbers chapter 10 verse 29, another book written by Moses. Numbers 10:29 refers to his father-in-law's name as Hobab. So you have this guy, he can't make up his mind, right? His name is Ruel, Jethro, and Hobab. And in fact, in some manuscripts of the Bible, There's also this name Jether. But most scholars would say Jether is probably just another spelling of Jethro, so not a big problem. Alright, so 3 names. And a lot of non-believing scholars who look at this and say, you see, the writer can't even get the name right. So he's just, this is all fiction, it's not real history. And I think the problem is very Western. You know why? Because Westerners are used to only having one name, their whole lives. Okay. Let me give you a story, another story. This is a true story.
I have 4 names.
You have 4 names. Tell us about your 4 names.
Well, actually, okay, so my English name is Matthew, but I have 2 middle names, Doug, Wyatt. Those are English names. But in Chinese, it's Duck White. So I actually have. Does Duck White count as one name or 2 names?
I suppose
Okay,
one
so
name.
then, including my surname, I have 5 names.
Okay. So Matthew is a Canadian Chinese and he's struggling with his identity.
I love pizza.
He loves pizza. No, he's Chinese, yeah. Okay, so there is this idea, of course, that there are name systems which are complicated by the fact that you move from one country to another country, a culture to another culture. The story I'm going to tell you is actually of a very famous Chinese man called Sun Yat-sen. Okay, Sun Yat-sen is known in the West as Sun Yat-sen, is the father of China, the first president of China, modern China. Right, Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is known. He is known by that name in the West. So you read all the books of history of China and all, they talk about Sun Yat-sen. In China, he's not known as Sun Yat-sen. He's Sun Zhongshan. Okay, in Taiwan, in China, in mainland China, in Taiwan, he's known as Sun Zhongshan. Okay, now 2 different people? No, it's still the same person. Yat-sen was a Cantonese pronunciation when he went to school in Hong Kong. Yixian in Mandarin. Yixian, sorry, Yixian, angel or genius. Xian, Yixian.
But Yi Xian is the how, it's not another name. Right?
Yeah.
So
You see, because what happens is when a person in the Chinese culture, when he's born, he is given one name. Then he has a milk name. When he grows up as a child, he has a nickname. Then when he goes to school, he has a new name, Yi Xian. He was born Sun Wen. Sun Wen, original name Sun Wen, went to school, Sun Yi Xian. And then he was baptized a Christian. And when he was baptized as Christian, his Christian name, his baptism name is Ri Xin, the new sun. Ri Xin, Sun Ri Xin. And when he was in exile in Japan, he was called Nakayama. And Nakayama is Zhongshan. So his Sun Zhongshan is Nakayama. Given to him by his Japanese friend, Nakayama. Okay, so one man, is he Japanese or what? No, he's not Japanese, but he's got a Japanese name because he lived in Japan for a while in exile. He was in Hawaii in exile, probably an English name there, we don't know. But he, therefore, one man born Sun Wen, and his ancestral name on it, when you die, you have a name. His name on the ancestral tablet is Sun Deming. Yeah.
You know that?
Yeah.
I don't know that.
So his name born Sun Wen, on his ancestral tablet Sun Deming. When in Japan, Sun Zhongshan. In Taiwan, the airport is called Zhongzheng.
No, Dongzhen is not.
Oh, this is Shanghai, is it? Oh, okay. Okay, so okay, sorry. Let's check. Okay, so Zhongshan is his Japanese name actually, right? And there, as mentioned, there was also his baptism name, Rishi, not very well known. So many names. One person can be referred to. If you were to do a biography of this man, you would have all these names mentioned in the same book. It doesn't mean that the book is wrong. doesn't mean that the book was written by different people who had no idea what his real name is. But when they look at Moses' father-in-law being referred to so many different names, they say, it's because they didn't know what his real name is, and the book is all fake. Okay, so that's because I think people who do not understand many name culture would think that way.